Numerous books, movies, and videos provide detailed documentation of the American Civil War's events and significance. Many historians excel in adopting a non-biased, fact-based approach to the Civil War. Yet the Civil War has earned a two-sided reputation in today's society. The goal of this series is to provide an unbiased and detailed account of the American Civil War, informing viewers on the events as they happened. To fully grasp the causes of the Civil War, we must delve into the events that transpired long before the first shots were fired in 1861 at Fort Sumter. Let's start by examining the political differences between the North and South during the American antebellum period. The North, with its growing industrial economy, favored tariffs and a strong central government. In contrast, the South, with its agrarian economy, supported states' rights and free trade. These political differences were deeply intertwined with the institution of slavery, as the South's economy relied heavily on slave labor. By understanding these political contrasts, we gain insight into the complex and deeply rooted tensions that eventually led to the Civil War. Now, let's take a look at the social differences between the North and South during the American antebellum period. The North was becoming more urbanized and industrialized, with a growing middle class and a focus on education and reform movements. The South, however, remained largely rural and agrarian, with a rigid social hierarchy that was maintained by the institution of slavery. These social differences contributed to the growing divide between the two regions. John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry was a pivotal event leading up to the American Civil War. In October 1859, John Brown, a fervent abolitionist, led a small group of followers in an attempt to seize the federal armory at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. His goal was to incite a slave rebellion that would spread throughout the South. For many in the North, Brown was seen as a martyr for the abolitionist cause, willing to sacrifice his life to end the institution of slavery. His trial and subsequent execution only heightened his status among Northern abolitionists, who viewed him as a hero fighting against an immoral system. In stark contrast, the South viewed John Brown as a terrorist and a madman. The raid exacerbated fears of a widespread slave uprising and fueled paranoia about Northern intentions. Southern newspapers and politicians used the event to illustrate the perceived threat posed by abolitionists and to rally support for the preservation of their way of life. For a nation that had long put off the issue of slavery, the time to choose a position had come. John Brown's actions and the polarized reactions to them highlighted the deep-seated divisions between the North and South, making it clear that the country was on an inevitable collision course. This single event became a flashpoint, igniting passions and setting the stage for the conflict that would soon engulf the nation. The presidential election of 1860 was a pivotal moment in American history. Abraham Lincoln, representing the Republican Party, won the presidency. His election was met with significant resistance from the Southern states, who viewed his anti-slavery stance as a direct threat to their way of life. Lincoln's victory was not just a win for the Republican Party, it was a turning point that would set the stage for the Civil War. As the results came in, Lincoln secured a majority of the electoral votes despite not being on the ballot in most Southern states. This outcome was perceived as an existential threat by many in the South. Almost immediately, calls for secession began to echo across the Southern states, leading to the formation of the Confederate States of America. The election of 1860 was not just an electoral battle. It was a clash of ideologies and visions for the future of the United States. It highlighted the irreconcilable differences between the North and the South, setting the stage for the inevitable conflict that would follow. Following Abraham Lincoln's election, the Southern states reacted with a mix of fear and defiance. Many states began to discuss secession as a means to protect their interests and maintain their way of life. Now we can explore the initial steps taken by these states, the formation of the Confederacy, and the events leading up to the outbreak of the Civil War. As the news of Lincoln's victory spread, Southern leaders convened emergency meetings to discuss their next steps. South Carolina was the first state to act, calling a special convention to consider secession. On December 20th, 1860, South Carolina officially declared its secession from the Union, setting a precedent that other Southern states would soon follow. The fear of losing their social and economic systems, which were heavily reliant on slavery, drove many Southern states to take drastic measures. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas soon joined South Carolina, each declaring their departure from the Union. These states formed a new nation, the Confederate States of America, with Jefferson Davis elected as its first president. The secession was not just a political maneuver. It was a declaration of a distinct identity and a commitment to preserving their way of life. The formation of the Confederacy marked a significant escalation in tensions between the North and the South, making conflict seem almost inevitable. The Buchanan administration, still in power until Lincoln's inauguration, struggled to address the rapidly deteriorating situation. Federal forts in the South became flashpoints, with Confederate forces seizing control of several installations. The most notable of these was Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, where tensions would soon reach a boiling point. As the Southern states solidified their new government, the North watched with growing concern. The stage was set for a confrontation that would ultimately determine the fate of the Union. The secession of the Southern states and the formation of the Confederacy were not just reactions to Lincoln's election. They were the culmination of years of growing division and animosity. With 7 states now in what they saw as a new country, the situation for United States service members in the South grew dire. On December 26, 1860, Major Robert Anderson, commanding a small garrison at Fort Moultrie, moved his men to the more defensible Fort Sumter located in Charleston Harbor. An attempt to resupply Anderson's command in early 1861 ended in failure when Confederate batteries opened fire on the unarmed vessel, forcing its retreat. Months dragged on, and the Buchanan administration did little in response to the growing threats against federal property. In April of that year, Brigadier General P.G.T. Beauregard, newly appointed commander of the Provisional Confederate Army, offered Anderson an ultimatum. He was to surrender the fort to Confederate forces and take his men north, or the Confederate batteries on the harbor shore would open fire. Anderson refused to surrender the fort, and on the early morning of April 12th, cannons from Beauregard's batteries began to bombard the fort. For 34 hours, Union and Confederate cannons exchanged fire with each other. Sumter was on fire, and Anderson's men worked diligently to put out the blaze while simultaneously avoiding enemy fire. Thankfully for the Union troops, a rain shower put out the flames. Louis Wigfall, a former U.S. Senator, now colonel in the Confederate Army, decided to take a boat to Sumter and speak with Anderson. He is quoted as saying the following: "You have defended your flag nobly, sir. You have done all that it is possible to do, and General Beauregard wants to stop this fight. On what terms, Major Anderson, will you evacuate this fort?" Robert Anderson agreed he and his men had done everything possible to defend the fort and their honor. A truce was agreed upon, and Anderson's command evacuated Fort Sumter for New York. What would soon prove to be an anomaly in the Civil War, no casualties occurred on either side during the battle, though 2 federal soldiers were killed during evacuation when a cannon malfunctioned and exploded. Likely, neither commander during the bombardment of Fort Sumter knew the overall effect their actions that day would have on the United States we see now. But one thing was now clear to both of them, and to the country. The rebellion was not going to pull punches and would have to be subdued by force. In response to the events in Charleston Harbor, President Lincoln, having barely been inaugurated for over a month, called for 75,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion. With an optimistic overtone, these volunteers were only required to sign 90-day contracts. The United States government truly did not grasp what kind of conflict this was going to be in early 1861. The call for volunteers to stop the rebellion from Washington inspired many young men from across the northern states. The governor of Ohio claimed the state could furnish the entirety of Lincoln's quota itself. Not all people, however, were enthusiastic about the call to arms. In fact, Virginia, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Arkansas all voted to secede from the Union and join the Confederacy. This would prove to be a monumental obstacle for federal commanders. Additionally, the slave-holding states of Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, and Missouri had many Southern sympathizers. These states would remain in the Union officially, but still had many men volunteer and fight in Confederate armies. They also had many men volunteer and fight in federal armies. They became known as the border states. The stage had now been set for the bloodiest conflict in American history. Regiments were mustered into service from small towns and cities across the North and South. Many volunteers were under the age of 18, as recruitment posts at the time did not require any proof other than the potential recruit attesting that they were over the age of 18. In fact, many a young man wrote the number 18 on a piece of paper and placed it inside his shoe. That way, in their eyes, when they said they were over 18, they were, in a way, telling the truth. Oftentimes, we read about the federal and Confederate government's reasons and objectives. The federal government wanted to extinguish the rebellion and have the states that had succeeded return to the Union, while the Confederate government wanted independence from the United States, and a constitution of its own that included an amendment protecting the institution of slavery. But what about the individual soldiers who were going to do the bleeding and dying? Each soldier had their own reason to go to war. One prevailing reason from both Northern and Southern soldiers' letters and memoirs was for the defense of their homes. Others couldn't stand back and watch their friends and family members go off without them. Some had the boyish naivety that it was going to be an adventure. Regardless of their logic behind taking up arms, they were all about to endure hardships many of them hadn't dreamed of in their wildest nightmares. In 1861, General Winfield Scott was General-in-Chief of all United States forces. Scott was the most celebrated commander of that time, second only to George Washington, because of his great success in the Mexican War 2 decades prior. Scott was now very old and would not remain in his position much longer. One of the final strategic proposals in his career was to the Lincoln administration. It was coined the Anaconda Plan and involved capturing the Mississippi River and naval blockades of all southern ports. The plan would essentially put the whole of the South in a gigantic siege, cutting off imports of valuable supplies from Europe and preventing exports like cotton that played a major role in the Southern economy. From our perspective now, it may seem like a very logical plan to slowly constrict the Southern states until they had no ability to sustain themselves. But the reality in 1861 was that there was mounting public and political pressure to put a swift end to the rebellion. The blockading aspect of Scott's plan was still on the table for the Lincoln administration, but it was ultimately decided that taking Richmond, Virginia, the capital of the Confederacy, was the fastest and most decisive way to end the war. With troops in Washington assembled, plans of massing an army to attack Richmond began to form. In our next chapter, the Army of Northwestern Virginia is formed under the command of Irving McDowell and marches to attack Beauregard's Army of the Potomac located at Manassas Junction, Virginia. The result of this battle will shock the public in both the North and South. A harsh reality is about to set in about warfare in the 1860s that the world has yet to witness.